Sure, I'll just start with a very brief introduction by saying if you read this morning's Chronicle of Higher Education, you'll have noticed that Betsy DeVos's Department of Education has just begun an inquiry into academic freedom at UCLA over some events that occurred in a course dealing with the history of racial injustice in the United States. And so it's clear that academic freedom is a hot topic, has been for many years in different contexts and remains so, especially since UCLA is one of the places now being investigated, among several other universities that are being investigated by the Department of Education. So Robert and I want to talk today about, of course, academic freedom. And we've kind of divided our talk into three parts. In the first part, Robert will give a very brief introduction to some of the history of academic freedom as defined by the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors in the United States. And then we will start to make much of our discussion much more specific to the University of California. And so I will talk about the origin of the modern version of the academic freedom policy at UC and discuss how that was extended to students. And then Robert will finish off with something that we both did a year ago. We chaired a working group which drafted a new policy on academic freedom for non-faculty academics, and Robert will describe that. Now, I would just say that a lot of this talk will be very UC-centric. A project that we've begun but haven't really gone far with yet is we've done a little bit of a survey of other universities and the extent to which they have serious written policies on academic freedom. And one of the things that most surprised me was that with one or two exceptions, and there are exceptions, most universities do not have detailed policies, written policies on academic freedom that clearly define it and clearly define how it's enforced. Unlike, for example, the University of California, which has well-developed policies. So that's one of the reasons why this talk is particularly UC centric. And with that, I'll turn it over to Robert.
Thanks, George. I think you hit on very much the note we want to discuss and why UC is so important to this discussion. It's because we are one of the few universities that has an explicit academic freedom policy where we say what it is. If you look at other universities, they just seem to presuppose it without actually defining it or characterizing it. And when we look at UC, what's very interesting about UC policy, the APM O&O, which we'll get to in a moment, just circles right back to the AAUP's statement, Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure of 1915. This is really the OR document of academic freedom in universities in the United States, and I would argue ought to be just conceptually a very foundational document. And as we'll see, UC's policy is really just a very much reflection of this. If you had a chance to read it, I obviously urge you to read it if you haven't. It's reads in an extraordinarily contemporary manner for a document that's over 100 years old. The issues that it touches upon, the worries that it expresses, the threats that it sees to the nature of the academic enterprise remain with us today in equal force and for many of the same reasons that were isolated in the statement in 1915. The 1915 statement really, I think, has three very, very important points which come over into the UC doctrine. The first one is what we could call the three freedoms. And they stated, I'll just quote, academic freedom in this sense comprises three elements: freedom of inquiry and research, freedom of teaching within the university or college, and freedom of extramural utterance and action. And those three notions, those are the three freedoms that really are meant to characterize what we mean by academic freedom and how it governs life as an academic, as a faculty member. The second issue that comes up, and I think they draw in this document an analogy which I think lives as strongly today as it did when it was brought up, between faculty, the notion of being an employee, and the notion of being an appointee. For all of us who work at the University of California, for any employer, but let's say the University of California, no matter what we do, we're employees of the corporate entity, in the sense that we get paid by it, we get benefits from it, and so on, which apply just in virtue of faculty being employees like anybody else. But faculty are something else. We are appointees. So the statement brings the analogy of federal judges and notes that a federal judge is appointed, and once appointed cannot be removed from that position for any reason other than incompetence or moral turpitude. So faculty are appointees in this sense. To the extent that we continue to do our job meeting professional standards, we have an indefinite tenure to continue in our position, provided that we conduct ourselves in an appropriately professional manner. This is, of course, obviously the foundation of tenure and the notion of tenure, and also of academic freedom, because note that federal judges are not constrained in the expression of their legal opinions by those who appoint them or those who maintain the judiciary. They have the freedom to fully express their opinions on the matter at hand. And that is comparable to faculty. We have that kind of freedom independent of the institution that governs or guarantees the freedom to express our views about matters just in the context of in the professional context. The third is, I've already intimated, that's brought up here. The third, I think, very important point is that our freedom depends and is subject to professional obligation. There are conditions which must be met for appropriate professional behavior in order for us to able to avail ourselves of the freedoms which fall under academic freedom. In the University of California, this distinction is very explicit in between APM 010, which gives the statement of academic freedom, and APM 015, which is the faculty code of conduct, which lays out the obligations of faculty that faculty must obey or are subject to in order to have academic freedom, and as well also the censures that would apply if those professional standards are abrogated. So those three things, if you've had a chance, again, sort of required reading here in this context, APM 010, the current contemporary statement of academic freedom, you will see that these three things are deeply embedded in it. But interestingly, in the UC context, the last one, the one of setting the professional obligations, has been directly assigned to the academic senate. So as it's noted there, by the bylaws and standing orders of the Board of Regents, it is the responsibility of the academic senate to both establish the professional standards which govern academic freedom and to ensure that faculty meet up to those obligations, including having procedures for dealing with issues when they are not. So the role of the academic freedom in setting professional standards is essential to the notion of academic freedom, and it follows on from what is stated in the statement that it's faculty who have the professional competence to set the professional standards. And that's why it's given to the academic senate as the constitutional institution of the faculty for shared governance. So that's really, I think, the major sort of historical background. And so let me turn this over to George, who then can elaborate on our current policies, in particular on APM 010 and 015.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robert. Since I was involved in the creation of the modern version of APM, a bit of background about how it came about. Back in 2002, UC Berkeley had a course that was listed in their catalog. It was entitled Palestinian Poetry, and it was taught by a graduate student under the supervision of a faculty member. And the course description for that course caused a major uproar within the state of California at the time. But the course description took a, how should I say, very Palestinian view of conflicts in the Middle East, and basically said students who don't agree with that point of view need not enroll in this course. And there was, as you might imagine, some uproar over that description. And that uproar made it all the way to the Academic Council of the University of California, where I served as the chair of the Senate at UC Santa Cruz. The Academic Council is the executive body of the Academic Senate. And can you hear me okay?
You were breaking up a little bit, George.
All right, I'll get closer. Does this help? Okay, so it came to the Academic Council of, and Dick Atkinson, who was then the president of the university, pushed very hard for changes at the Berkeley campus. And those changes did come into effect. They did change the course description of the course. The changed course description did not satisfy President Atkinson. It did satisfy the then chair of the Academic Senate at Berkeley. And there was, shall we say, a very heated discussion between Atkinson and this chair over the adequacy of that change in the description. Finally, and I could just editorialize and say, I think the revised description basically brought the course description pretty much at the borderline of what would be acceptable or not acceptable. In any event, this motivated Dick Atkinson to want to take a look at the academic freedom policy of the University of California. And that academic freedom policy, which was already incorporated in the Academic Personnel Manual and had been drafted in 1934, and it basically associated academic freedom with scholarship that gave play to intellect rather than passion. And it conceived of scholarship as dispassionate and is concerned only with the logic of facts. Those were words taken from the then policy on academic freedom within the university, dispassionate and concerned with the logic of facts. And it basically assessed scholarship by the motivations that led to its production. Atkinson very intelligently called in one of the leading experts on the First Amendment, Robert Post, who was then a law faculty member at Berkeley, formerly called Bolt Hall. And Post actually drafted a new version of an academic freedom policy for UC. And that version was presented by Dick and Robert Post to the Academic Council. And I will tell you the reaction of most council members at the time was, wow, this is great. We can't believe that something this good has been presented to us already. So what ensued were, you know how universities work. The Academic Council chewed on it for a while, edited it a little bit, sent it out to the campuses for comments. And then it all came back and ultimately went to the Academic Assembly, which is the legislative body of the Academic Senate, for approval. I didn't play a major role in the revision of the APM 010 because, number one, the final version that was finally adopted is remarkably close to the version that Dick and Robert presented to us on the first day. There were some words here and some words there that were changed. It was remarkably similar. And the other reason I wasn't all that heavily involved was that there were three big issues before the Academic Senate at the time. This was one of them. The other, second one was a revision of the bylaws, which I was leading. And the third one was the enactment of a policy on romantic relations between students and faculty, which I was also leading. So I had my hands full at the time. Anyway, ultimately, there was a meeting of the Academic Assembly during the summer of 2003, and they either unanimously or very nearly unanimously adopted this proposed version of APM 010, and that's the version that's in effect today. Once the Senate had adopted it, the only thing that was left was for the president to actually issue the document. I, in the meantime, had been elected vice chair of the academic system-wide Senate. And so I actually moved my office to Oakland a month before Dick Atkinson departed the presidency. And it turned out that Dick, at the last minute, wanted to make some changes to the document. In particular, he wanted to change the title of the document to reflect the fact that this applies only to faculty and not to students. And I objected to that on more or less procedural grounds that, in fact, there had been plenty of time to make changes, and the Senate had approved this version, and I was reluctant to say that there should be changes at the last minute. So Dick and I had a very animated conversation about this subject. And no, he made some good points, and I thought I made some good points in that conversation. And I mean, I remember making the point that, you know, I'm an astrophysicist, and I said, if I write a paper that says, that's really crazy, that says the moon is made of green cheese, you might think I'm crazy, but if I publish it in a refereed journal that undergoes peer review, you couldn't really fire me because I would be protected by academic freedom because I'd met professional standards by publishing in a peer-reviewed journal. But if I wrote that paper with one of my students, it wouldn't be fair for you to be able to go after that student if they're not protected by the same type of academic freedom that I enjoy. Dick made the point that all courses, for example, do need to be under the direction of faculty members at the university. So when students teach courses, and you're thinking, of course, of Berkeley and Palestinian poetry, there cannot be complete freedom for them to do anything. So in any event, at the end of the day, Dick agreed to adopt the version that had been approved by the Assembly, and that's the version that's before you today. And it's quite different than the previous policy on academic freedom in a number of regards. As I said, the old policy assessed scholarship by the motivations that led to its production. Remember, I said dispassionate, whereas the new policy, as you'll see, looks instead at the content of scholarship as being the measure. So it doesn't, you know, the revised version, as you'll see, does not distinguish between interested and disinterested. Instead, it differentiates between competent and incompetent scholarship. So the new policy, and as I think first pointed out by Robert Post, most faculty members are not dispassionate about what they do. Most scholars are passionate about what they do. Passion or dispassion cannot be the measure of whether something is good or should be protected, but rather the key element, and it's one of what I think of as the three key principles embodied in APM 010, is whether or not it meets professional standards, whether it's teaching meeting professional standards, whether it's research meeting professional standards. It's the standards of the profession that really matter. And that's the fundamental principle that measures the scholarship. And that's the fundamental change from what had been previously the standard, that is, scholarship should be measured by the standards of the profession or the field of study, whether it be teaching or research or whether it be comments on public service or on the university itself. So that's one of the fundamental principles embodied in the new version of the academic freedom policy. The second fundamental principle is that faculty, although they do have academic freedom, which they enjoy as a freedom to work on what is appropriate, to do the scholarship they think is appropriate, etc., if they meet professional standards. But they also, as Robert alluded to earlier, have obligations to the university and to their students. And those obligations are set forth in the faculty code of conduct. So an academic freedom policy is not a blank check. It is not a get out of jail free card to do anything you want. It is instead an expression of freedom subject to the obligations set forth in the faculty code of conduct. You have an obligation to teach material relevant to courses. You have an obligation to meet your courses, for example, as examples of obligations that are not protected by academic freedom. So that's the second fundamental principle here, namely that, yes, there's freedoms, but there's also obligations. And the third one is a point that, again, Robert made earlier, that the group whose expertise is, or responsibility is, to ensure academic freedom and that's applying appropriate academic standards, that group is assigned to the academic senate or the faculty of the university, who have the role of determining whether or not appropriate academic standards are being met. And in the case of academic freedom, that means that faculty members who believe their academic freedoms are being violated have the right to, for example, file a grievance with the campus privilege and tenure committee, have a right to a hearing before that committee, a factual hearing, in order to determine whether their rights or privileges have been violated. So it's those three principles that are embodied in APM 010. The three principles being, again, just to review, professional standards being the key measure of academic quality. Number two, professional obligations being there as well. And number three, the arbiter of the academic senate in establishing professional standards or academic standards. So that took care of academic freedom, and that was adopted, and there was quite little, very little controversy surrounding this policy, surprisingly little controversy. So it didn't end there, because I remembered that conversation I'd had with Dick about student academic freedom, which I, for one, took very seriously. And so what I did after I became chair of the Academic Senate was I invited the student regent, who is extremely interested in these issues of academic freedom. I invited him to come and meet with the Senate System-Wide Committee on Academic Freedom to discuss what rights or privileges should students enjoy under academic freedom. And that led to a very interesting set of conversations that year. The next year, after I had departed the scene, the Senate set up a joint administrative Senate task group with representatives from academic freedom, representatives from the administration, and from student affairs to come up or to draft a policy on what academic freedom rights, if any, should students enjoy within the university. And it's a complicated issue. And it's a complicated issue because, to put it bluntly, there are students and then there are students. I mean, not all students are created equal. For example, it depends upon the intellectual maturity of, or the development or the status of a student. For example, graduate students engaging in teaching might enjoy different types of rights than an undergraduate student in a classroom, or a research or a postdoc or a student doing research, graduate student doing research might enjoy a different level of freedom or scrutiny than might an undergraduate student doing a project in a class. And any policy has to be able to cover that range of activities. But ultimately, the group came up with a policy, which I thought was a really good one. And it's in principle called the Statement of Student Freedom of Scholarly Inquiry. So the words were very carefully chosen not to include academic freedom, but rather to talk about student freedom of scholarly inquiry. And it was clear that that student freedom of scholarly inquiry derived from the faculty freedom or the faculty academic freedom. It was a subsidiary type of freedom that existed because of faculty academic freedom. And it was an opportunity to talk about the competence of student work at each level of the educational process, and pointed out that the substance and nature of these standards for student work properly lie within the expertise and authority of the faculty as a body. So we had here kind of two principles. One is that the student freedom of scholarly inquiry derived from faculty academic freedom. And secondly, it was the faculty who had the authority to assess the nature of these standards that we would apply to students in order to determine the student freedom of scholarly inquiry. And that was the fundamental principle involved. So de facto, students essentially have the same freedoms that faculty do, but it's a little bit different. They don't quite have the same freedoms under this policy, but they certainly have a great deal of freedom of inquiry. So that's where university policy ended up. And this principle of student freedom of scholarly inquiry was then added to APM 010 as kind of an appendix to the policy itself. And that all of this was done in the early 2000s. And that's where things stayed until maybe 2 years ago. Because 2 years ago, we started asking the question, what about the academic freedom of people who are not faculty, but who are doing teaching and research? And for that, I'll turn this back to Robert.
Thanks, George. So, as George pointed out, and this comes from the initial statement from the AAUP, academic freedom is associated with faculty. And if you think about, sort of rewind, your head back to 1915, it's really only faculty are the ones who are doing the research, doing the teaching. And since academic freedom is about those activities, about that academic work that faculty do, academic freedom is something which applies kind of structurally to faculty. Now, some of you may recall almost 3 years ago now, there was quite a bit of coverage in the press about the UC Librarians Union, who were bringing up the point that they were not covered by academic freedom, and they felt that they ought to be, and were making this something which they wished to negotiate in their contract, which was then being negotiated, they had an open contract, and they were negotiating it to be given academic freedom as sort of something they were bargaining for. Some of us, at that time, I was chair of the Academic Senate, and it was very clear to me and many others that one, academic freedom, as we've been discussing it and as it is embodied in the University of California, is not something which is negotiable. It's not something which is subject to collective bargaining. It doesn't fall under what can be collectively bargained, namely wages, benefits, and working conditions. It's something about the nature of the institution, the nature of governance of the university. And so it's not something which could be negotiated. Nevertheless, the Academic Council felt strongly that there was a real issue, that librarians and others in the university, other researchers, agronomists, many people around the university, did things, undertook activities which ought to be covered under academic freedom, which should be governed by academic freedom. They should have those rights. So the Academic Council, drafted a statement to that effect, sent it along, and in response, Provost Michael Brown formed a committee to develop a policy which would deal with the issue. And George and I were asked to co-chair that committee, which we did. I will say, having, like many of you, been on more committees than we care to remember, this one really ranked right at the top of enjoyable experiences. It was a wonderful committee, which enormous amount of conviviality, extremely high level of discussion among the members, and with respect for opinion, embodied in itself the highest virtues of academic freedom as people express their views and trying to develop a policy. Right at the beginning, however, we did almost immediately hit upon sort of the key issue, which is one I sort of alluded to a moment ago, that in 1915 and also carried through into APM 010 was the idea that academic freedom was associated with faculty. They were the ones who did that work, and hence, the academic work, and hence they were the ones who had academic freedom. But what may have been true in 1915 was certainly not true of the modern university, in which the things that faculty do are done by many people in the university, including librarians, all sorts of researchers, people in A&R. A wide range of people partake in the activities that faculty partake in, that is primarily research, teaching, and public service. Yet for faculty, these were protected activities, but for when they were done by others, they were not protected activities. And so what we put forward, and which is the heart of this new policy, APM 011, is the idea that we want to look at things functionally, not structurally. So academic freedom you do not have academic freedom in virtue of the position and the institutional structure that you have, being a faculty member, but rather in virtue of the things you do within the university context. So if you are someone who does teaching and does research, then you are to be governed by the rights which are bestowed under APM 010, and are subject to the responsibilities and obligations that go along with those rights as specified in APM 015. So the first part of the policy which we developed effectively embodies this functional perspective and hence extends those rights and responsibilities to those who do teaching and research, as long as you're an academic appointee. And that's something which is actually officially listed in the APM. But we came also with another innovation, and this was really a very, I think, cogent and important point that the librarians put forward, which is that, sure, we agree that if we're doing teaching or doing research, which librarians do, we're happy with that, but we librarians and others in the university do an enormous amount of work which aids and supports the academic mission of the university. And those activities should be protected as well. And we agreed with that because we saw that those activities are also governed by professional standards. So to the extent that academic freedom is connected, as George was describing, it's connected to professional standards, so too would there be protections for other activities which support the fundamental missions of the university, insofar as they too are protected by professional standards, and that the university would take responsibility for ensuring that those professional standards were respected for the work that these various people do. So those are the two. That is truly an innovation. I think the APM 011, and this is really what George and I are going to write about, there are two fundamental innovations in the nature of academic freedom, in this notion of academic freedom that stems from the 1915 statement. One is a shift from it being applied, and it applies to those in virtue of their function in the university, not in terms of their structural position in the university. And secondly, that the university also protects activities that not are directly teaching and research, but support those activities insofar as that support is governed by professional standards. So those are the two big innovations. The rest of the policy is taken up with how you grieve and the various procedures of grievance. You can look at those at your own interest. But conceptually, those are the two main developments that APM 011 brought forward. Again, it went out, as George said, for 010. It went out for review. That was, I think, livelier, the discussion, than perhaps for 010. It led to very little revision. The committee felt that, some were things which were irrelevant, others were, practical matters that are not dealt with in policy, and others we just disagreed with and we're not going to be moved by. So the policy pretty much went forward as formulated and met with the approval of the Academic Council and the Academic Assembly, both unanimously, and was on February 1st, 2020, got the approval of the provost and was issued as UC policy. The last kicker on this, at the time the policy was formulated, one of the main groups we wrote this to protect were the academic researchers. We wrote it with them in mind. The librarians and the academic researchers were the two main groups within the university which demanded our attention as we constructed this policy. As you may know, the academic researchers unionized, and at the time of the policy was being formulated and issued, they were in negotiations, and in their negotiations, they explicitly requested to be exempted from APM 011. Hence, represented academic researchers by their own decision do not have academic freedom, or not protected by the rights and responsibilities of academic freedom, as are others at the University of California. We thought that was, we were getting, just did not understand really the reasons for that, but that's what they wanted to do. So that kind of brings you up to date. Just before I throw it open, just to reiterate, UC is just an amazing case study of academic freedom. And as I said, it's one brand, others have different views of it, but is the thread that is the dominant thread that really begins in 1915 with the AAUP statement. And at least in my own personal opinion, I think George and I are in pretty much complete agreement about this. This really is the heart of academic freedom and what it means, what guarantees the quality of research, the quality of teaching as it's done in universities, and what gives people faith in what we do. I mean, it's because of academic freedom that university research is trusted in a way, say, that industry research is not. And so I think we really believe, I certainly believe, this is really the cornerstone and the working notion, the notion that actually governs academic work as it's done in a university, and in particular in our university. So with that, I think we can throw it open for any comments or questions.
Great, thank you. Questions?
I recall some of the arguments I heard from Martin Troe about various aspects of the change in policy during the period that George was talking about. And one of the things that was argued about, if I recall correctly, and what Martin had a strong opinion about, was that the content of courses needed to provide some balanced interpretation. That, in other words, they shouldn't be strictly politically driven analysis, which can have, I mean, according to George's definition, or I should say the resulting definition that came out, if it passes muster through some kind of process of academic review, then, okay, then it's legit, right, in some form. But I don't have an answer to this, but it's just back to this question of what is the responsibilities of a faculty person or the person teaching a course to provide some sense of balance about the subject matter if it has a political hue. I mean, maybe this doesn't apply, although I guess it could, to astronomy. Because somebody might say that the world is flat, and I don't know, something like that. But I don't know whether you guys have looked at that issue. I know it was discussed, and there was letters. I recall various letters and things that went on in the early, I guess, late 1990s and into the new century. But what's your thinking on that? And is there any kind of judgment about that in the actual APM now?
Can I make a stab at that, George?
Sure, go ahead.
I think there's two things, John. I mean, whether it's in the APM, I'd have to go back and look at fine print in APM 015. I do not believe it is. My own personal view is that faculty are under no obligation to present a balanced view. They are under an obligation to present material that is, of the appropriate professional standard in the course. So if I wanted to teach a course in Marxism, I would be perfectly within my rights to give it all about Marxism, its ins, its outs, its development. And even, if I'm a Marxist, maybe even agree with it. I'm under no obligation to also talk about capitalism in that context at all, as long as the materials I'm using are appropriate materials and are taught in an appropriate professional manner. So I don't think there's any obligation at all. And in fact, I think it would be an abrogation of academic freedom to force me as a faculty member to teach things in my course, in a certain way. So my answer to that is no, there is no obligation, nor ought there be an obligation to present a balance. You can do that if that's pedagogically appropriate. And nothing against it, but I don't think there's an obligation to do so.
I would just add to that I presume that's the standard that's also applied in undergraduate courses, the Committee on Undergraduate Courses, because that's also supposed to be this kind of place for making sure that professional standards are being upheld. Although I get kind of confused because I think that a lot of courses are grandfathered, they just, they can morph, they can do whatever, but there is a process for that as well. So I presume that standard is upheld.
Yeah, I mean, look, John, if you design a course, sorry, George, I'll just want to, you have to give a coherent course. And I think the Committee on Courses is trying to say, is this a coherent course to teach on this topic? You only have, 10 or 15 weeks, depending on where you're teaching. You can only cover so much. So I think there are standards for what counts as a professionally presented course, that it be coherent, that it be appropriate to the topic, and so on. But I do not believe there ought to be a standard that it's in any way, balanced against all the, views which have gotten make professional muster. So I don't think we would be disputing whether a course in evolution, also has to include something about creationism. But we are talking about, whether a course has to express all views about a particular topic. I don't think that in and of itself is an operant principle. George, I'm sorry. I didn't mean
No, I basically agree with you. Just to your point, John, about courses not being reviewed. I mean, I don't know about Berkeley, but I know on some campuses, certainly at Santa Cruz, the Committee on Courses does review courses periodically if they've been on the books a long time, just to see that they're still up to snuff. And I think that is an obligation to say.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. But there's another issue about teaching courses in, say, European history, because a characteristic way of describing the period of the 17th and 18th century is the period of European expansion. Well, this involves actually the enslavement of people, the taking over of land all over the world belonging to others. But that's not how European history is modeled, shall we say. While it may recognize that what was going on by contemporary standards is unacceptable, that is how it was conceived of at the time. This is extraordinarily difficult to deal with in the classroom, because somehow there's the idea that the only slavery that ever existed is the heritage of slavery that we are dealing with today. And the people who perpetuated this are seen often as being these evil, conscious persecutors of people. It's become almost impossible to present what is the European perspective in a classroom with students who see it from an entirely different perspective, which is all, in my view, also legitimate. It's simply not what the course is about. It's talking certainly about colonialism and the kinds of things which happened, but from the perspective of the people doing it, which is what the course may be trying to get students to understand, it can be rejected right out of hand. So that becomes a tricky issue. And so how would you deal with that?
If I may, look, it's not simply that issue. There are a lot of issues which range from the way course materials are presented in a changing world with changing values, to issues having to do with external behavior of faculty. I presume that one of the professional responsibilities that a faculty member has, or anyone who's standing up in front of a classroom, is to maintain a learning environment, to maintain an environment in which learning can occur. Now, and if you don't, as a faculty member or someone teaching the class, you should be subject to some form of censure. That's part of your responsibilities as governed by the Faculty Code of Conduct. But what happens when you come into the classroom, you teach something with accepted materials, trying to express, from an appropriately pedagogical manner to tell of the views of a time or a set of views, but that students have made a judgment that creates an inappropriate, hostile environment for learning, and it fundamentally erodes the learning environment. You've taught an approved course in a perfectly professional manner using appropriate materials. How do we judge that situation? I think this is, a question has to do, and I said it ties also into the nature of external behavior. When people outside of the university make racist tweets or participate in inappropriate sexual behaviors, or for some reason, raise the opprobrium of the students for some reason, who feel that just that person in the classroom pollutes the environment, and hence undermines the ability of their ability to learn in their judgment. Mm-hmm. How do we deal with that? I think that's a very burning question right now. I don't know the answer, but I think it's one of the major questions we're dealing with, because we've always had a very much, this professional view was set by the faculty. The students really did not have a say on what, if you walked in and did it in a professional manner, used appropriate materials, students, if they didn't want to take the class, they didn't want to take the class. If they didn't like you, they could say so in evaluations, but you were not judged to be incompetently, or you ought not be judged to be incompetently teaching. But times have changed, and there's been a big swing, or at least a greater recognition of the student voice in saying what constitutes an appropriate learning environment. And how are we to talk about that and think about that? I think we need to discuss it. I don't know I have an answer particularly, or even necessarily a view at this point, but I do have an articulation of the question. And I think the question you bring up, taken out to this broader context, is one of the most important issues we have to really be grappling with in the context of academic freedom right now.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I'm deeply concerned about it, because I also feel that the tendency is, well, I haven't studied it, so I can't say the tendency. It appears that too often in the cases that are reported in higher education, or the Chronicle of Higher Education and various other higher ed newspapers, that faculty members get immediately hauled out of the classroom if their points of view or their language or something that they might have been saying is deemed inappropriate by students. And what disturbs me about this is that faculty aren't getting, throughout the country apparently, always the kind of review and hearing even by the administration, that there's a choice made, that in today's climate, the students are right and the faculty member has to leave that course or classroom. Now, this is the thing which is very disturbing.
Well, I certainly would agree that it's very disturbing, which is one of the reasons that we've emphasized the role of the academic senate in determining appropriateness. And so normally the academic senate doesn't, in the absence of some clear and present danger kind of thing, haul someone out of the classroom. It can happen. I can think of, you know, an example of where it happened that I'm familiar with, where it involves sexual harassment issues or potential sexual harassment issues, which I think justified immediate action.
Absolutely.
But in terms of academic, you know, freedom issues, once it's adjudicatable by the academic senate or by the faculty, I think that needs to take precedence. Excuse me, just let me add one more thing to that. But just because I claim that that's the case at UC doesn't mean it's the case at universities around the country.
Right.
As we said kind of at the beginning of this, we've been struck by how virtually you go to any university's website, and somewhere on the website they will bow to academic freedom and say, our university fully supports academic freedom. But usually they don't express to whom that academic freedom applies. They usually don't have a policy that clearly delineates that policy, what academic freedom is. And they don't have clearly defined mechanisms of appeal, mechanisms of adjudication. So those things are often lacking at other universities.
Okay. Bill?
Hi, everyone. I have a couple questions. The first question is, while academic freedom, the focus is largely on the individual faculty member, there is, in addition to that, and connected to some of the comments earlier, an institutional dimension of academic freedom. In other words, it's the collective judgment of the faculty, of the academic senate, that is at issue in a number of cases. So for example, I was thinking of the Stearns litigation years ago, where a set of Christian schools were trying to have the university credit creationist, biology courses and so on. So my first question is, can you comment on external attacks to the collective judgment of the Senate and of faculty, whether in admissions or A through G, et cetera? My second question, maybe more for Robert May, is, there is this rich kind of back and forth between people like Robert Post and Judith Butler that speaks to the sense in which academic freedom is enveloped by, what you might call an epistemic paradox. In other words, there are very contested notions of professional competency that undergird the defense of academic freedom. And those professional standards evolve and change and are subject to dispute. But the process for that change is itself tethered to the very processes of academic professional competence that differentiate academic freedom from other things, including free speech rights, et cetera. So maybe you could comment on either or both of those questions.
George, I'm willing to take number two.
All right, and so I'll talk to number one.
Okay.
Number one concerned external forces on the university, and if I would just step back for a second, I would say that one of the prime raison d'etre for universities is the fundamental protection of academic freedom. That's what universities do: protect freedom of inquiry, create new knowledge, be willing to do things that are out of the norm. So I think that a university not just its faculty, but the university as a whole has a role in protecting academic freedom. When there are external pressures, fine, there can be external pressures, but that's why I think it's important that the faculty apply the standards that they do. You gave the example of creationism as being a justifiable course. Well, if the faculty of the university were to say that was so, even if I personally might disagree, I would feel obliged to accept that, because to me they're the adjudicators of that issue. But so my answer to your question is yes, it is the faculty. I think we count on the faculty to apply those standards reasonably. But I would also emphasize that this is a major role for the university writ large to protect academic freedom and freedom of inquiry. So it isn't just the faculty who have that responsibility.
I just want to add to that, because I know that that Bill knows this too, but I mean, there is precedent as well within the courts, and particularly the Supreme Court, about what are the areas of responsibility for universities. I mean, it's always tenuous, subject to the next, ruling by a conservative court or whatever. But a really famous one is 1959, in which the dissenting decision, actually, but it stood up in court, was that the university had the right, if I remember, it's the four freedoms: teaching, selection of faculty, selection and admission, and that this is a professional competency of the institution to do it itself. Why am I forgetting the fourth one? And actually, it was based on a ruling that came out of South Africa, and I don't quite know how that links, but so there is this kind of court, but it is, I think, subject to change as to what is the rights. And you're not supposed to obviously abridge or violate other constitutional freedoms in that process, but usually the courts have deferred, and that's definitely the case with Bakke, and at least up to now, the Supreme Court has deferred to the universities for their professional ability to make decisions. But anyway.
So let me just, I will throw in a little bit about your first question, Bill. I think what's important when you look at UC policy, about the institution, is that APM O&O basically takes the institution as it looks at it as an issue of governance. And because academic freedom is part of the governance, the Academic Senate has a role to play in its role in shared governance, through its governance role. So the Academic Senate as a body has a role to play institutionally because of the relationship, as seen at UC, of academic freedom to university governance. Individual faculty are beneficiaries of academic freedom and exercise it appropriately with respect to the faculty code of conduct. So I do think you're right. We need to distinguish between the Academic Senate as an organ of governance and individual faculty members who actually may not be members of the Academic Senate, who nevertheless are beneficiaries of academic freedom. Also, on a second point you made about creationism, the 1915 statement is very clear to distinguish between proprietary institutions and non-proprietary institutions. And it's very clear that academic freedom doesn't apply necessarily to proprietary institutions, ones which are there as basically voices of propaganda, be that religious propaganda or some kind of political propaganda, that those institutions are formulated for indoctrination of those points of view. So arguably, if you're a religious institution on the basis of the 1915 policy statement, creationism would be a perfectly appropriate course to give, and faculty could be required to teach it. I think the tension is that we have, faculty in the contemporary world who are educated in non-proprietary institutions, and because of job considerations are working in proprietary institutions, but feel that the values are ones which are, that they're not excluded from academic freedom because of it. And that's a very great tension that we have with respect to the notion of academic freedom. Just briefly on Post versus Butler, on my read, they're talking at cross purposes. Post notion of professional standards have to do with the way in which you comport yourself in a classroom. The notion that there is peer governance, that there is peer review, that there is faculties basically vetting the quality of other members of the faculty's research. Butler is at a level of what are the actual standards by which things are being evaluated and how they change over time, and the vested interests which may try to perpetuate standards of what counts as a good piece of research, today, which is being, they're saying it isn't, but on different standards of contemporary standards there are. So there's a discriminatory aspect to this exercise of academic freedom based on the those who have power to legislate the particular actual standards. But Post is at a higher level. Post is at a higher level, and I think Butler misses this in her critique of Post, that she basically agrees there should be peer review. She's not denying there should be peer review, which is what Post is standing up for. She's just saying, what's determining what constitutes an appropriate review? What are the standards that you're reviewing on? And how do those change with respect to this, time? How are they affected by political considerations, cultural situations, changes in social attitudes, and so on? So I think that actually Post and Butler are way more compatible in their points of view than either really want to let on in terms of their dispute, because they both do agree about institutions and the role of institutions and professional standards at this more general level. I don't think they disagree about that. As I pointed out in our initial discussion, I think Butler brings up a very good point about, if you do believe that institutions are central to this, what happens when those institutions are corrupt, if they're subject to political control, to religious control, to being determined by corporate interests, by outside entities, and so on. What happens when that occurs? And I think that is a very interesting issue, which we really need to grapple with, because the potential for corruption is so great. And we're seeing it now. The pressure is to corrupt our institutions coming out of the current administration. So I think that is a very important and central issue, how we deal with the sanctity of the institution.
Who had a hand up?
Not sure how you're doing. My little hand.
Yes, Brian.
Two thoughts. One, and it's very similar to Bill's comment, or at least parallel to it. I would think that the process of debate and tension inside the classroom between students, particularly the changing demographics of modern students, and the canon in any one of a number of the social sciences and humanities, is an ordinary, expected, and in many ways to be welcomed part of our lives. For the last 50 years, the question of whether it's European expansion or colonialism and the destruction of indigenous cultures, those have been conversations. Sometimes students have been in the lead of them, sometimes they haven't been. But the number of times when faculty have been, as you put it, hauled out of the classroom, when compared with the number of times faculty have not wished to ever even engage in that conversation, seems to me very disproportionate. And so if I were to think about it, I'd say it's healthier, let's put it that way, that those kinds of conversations could be contained within the university, whether it's in a classroom or in a department or on a campus. The danger now, it seems to me, is far greater from outside, from a concerted effort by the right wing to demonize universities. If you put in if you Google loyalty oath UC, you don't get a reference to the historic struggle around the loyalty oath. What you get is a right-wing publication that claims that faculty at UC have to take a new loyalty oath in order to be hired, in which they devote themselves to these heinous things like diversity and social justice, and it is a full-throated criticism. When that then appears in a Republican-dominated legislature like North Carolina's, you've suddenly got a really serious intervention from outside against the university's autonomy and against against its own notions, Bob, of what professional even means. So that if the image of the professions or the professionals guiding academic matters is that they're all left-wing fanatics, then the politics of the right wing becomes extraordinarily hostile. And it seems to me that one of the things that is an institution's responsibility, and here it gets very delicate what language you use, is to protect its own ownership of that evolving, contradictory, sometimes hostile and difficult conversation about the canon, rather than concede or give in. That's extraordinarily hard if you're a public institution in a right-wing place and your state of Arizona has just ruled ethnic studies impermissible, right? Or, or Texas has said you can't do anything in which critical race theory is used. The protection of the ability of the institution to continue to evolve and change seems to me absolutely central. So that academic freedom is simultaneously, I don't know what George, what word you use precisely, you're defending institutional autonomy, institutional independence, you're making a claim for the institution's ability to govern those kinds of things by itself. Because in the end, they control the budgets very often, they can pass legislation. Almost no institution in the country other than the University of California has the constitutional autonomy that we have that allows us certain freedoms, even with regard to the legislature. So I don't know whether it's hard to imagine this becomes a new part of an academic freedom codicil or, thing. But I do think, given the current context, maybe this is slightly resolved if Biden wins in November. But I think it's going to be an enduring struggle over the next several years, because we have clearly been targeted by an organized conservative assault on our autonomy and our capacity. And it's all caricature. It's very seldom real, but it's very powerful, particularly in...
I don't know, I'll speak for myself and maybe for the others. That was beautifully and absolutely correctly put. That was, I would only take exception to one very, very small item, that the election of Biden will change anything in this regard whatsoever. You're absolutely correct. And historically, this is the battle of academic freedom from the foundations of the university, except for centuries, it was the church. Who was always trying to direct and guide and have that influence. And the first sort of literally almost 800 years of the history of universities is about the detachment of the influence of the church from academic pursuits and the ability of universities to provide appropriate sanctuaries for thought and without outside meddling, in particular from the church. So what you bring up is just another chapter, and in an ongoing saga starts with the foundations and the very conception of universities. I like to think of universities as just what a university is academic freedom. The bricks and mortar is just the institution built to protect it. It's the fort, if you will. And not many people think of it the other way around. I think of it, we start with the value. Universities are a value. And then we have to construct an institution that allows that value to flourish in the proper and the constructive way. And you're absolutely right. It is intended to be a protective environment. It must be. And that's where, because without it, we have no such thing as academic freedom. So I absolutely sign on. I think that was extraordinarily eloquently put.
I agree that it was, I completely agree that it was eloquently put. And I think Brian raised another point that I think is worth considering, and that is, who is the guarantor for universities' academic freedom? For example, a few years ago, there was a big controversy at the University of Wisconsin about whether or not academic freedom should be guaranteed by the legislature or by the regents. And it was a big deal when the legislature washed their hands of academic freedom and said to the regents, you worry about it. even in California, it's an issue. For example, as Brian pointed out, at the University of California, because of constitutional autonomy, the regions have the authority to guarantee academic freedom. And other than controlling the budget of the university, the legislature in California has no role in determining what's taught in the classroom, for example. They can punish us budgetarily, but they can't make those determinations. On the other hand, that's not the case for the California State University system. And we just saw that over the course of the last month, where the Board of Regents, after consultation with the Senate at the CSU system, passed a new undergraduate requirement requiring all undergraduates to take a course in either ethnic studies or social justice. Meanwhile, the state legislature passed a new law requiring that the CSU require a course in ethnic studies without the social justice alternative. Now, I'm not expressing an opinion about who is right or who is wrong about that. What I am expressing an opinion about is my discomfort with the notion that the legislature will be mandating or by law a requirement that this course or that course be required for graduation at the CSU. I think that that's something that should be within the purview of the academic senate of the California State University system. But we're seeing this played out even in liberal California.
Right.
The governor vetoed that bill last night, actually. That piece of legislation was vetoed by Governor Newsom. And the only other thing I'd say is that in some ways, I really welcome the challenge from students. In other words, if they represent an internal constituency that's kind of they're on the borders of the internal external. They represent the changing demography of the state, the transformation of its sociology. And therefore, if they challenge me, if they think I've got an old-fashioned canon, I'd much prefer to be in a conversation with them than with state representatives. That's all.
Well, I think Brian, you made a point that maybe I'd like to emphasize a little bit, which is that the concept of part of what we get to decide, what the faculty gets to decide, is to give content to the concept of being an educated person. What constitutes being an educated person? And that's something which evolves over time. So 50, 60, 70 years ago, part of that definition meant you spoke at least one foreign language, okay? That was part of being an educated person, that you had some competence in foreign languages. That no longer is part of what we take to be an educated person. But what we've substituted is that you have technical competence, that you have competence in formal matters. We only have so much, but we've made a change, a fundamental change. And the curriculum reflects, the change and evolution of our curriculum reflects our evolving ideas. Now, like in any change that's always like that, we're going to have, the avant-garde and we're going to have the reactionaries. And we always face that problem. I mean, the one about, there's still language reactionaries who just bemoan the fact that we churn out students, we call them educated, and they can't speak a foreign language. But that's not our conception any longer. And we are in a point for all sorts of reasons, I would say mainly good reasons, where we are undergoing a significant change in our curriculum, and particularly in the humanities and social sciences, with what constitutes, what we take to be the things an educated person should know. And that's, has to do with, so-called, post-colonial interpretations. Right. So, and I leave off so-called there. I shouldn't have said that. I think that's important. And I agree with you, Brian. That's something that is part of the life of a university. A university that is not constantly doing that does not have the vitality we expect of a university. Mm-hmm. And every great university embodies that. And it's disruptive. It's contentious. It leads to flaring of tempers and all sorts of issues. Many of them in the modern age, very, very distasteful, but nevertheless essential to the academic enterprise.
Right. Matt, you were trying to get in there.
Oh, sorry, Matt, apologies.
No, not at all. I didn't want to re-interrupt. It was so interesting. Thanks. I have a question about the structure. And so this analogy may be bad, but if I followed, it seems like academic freedom it derives from the faculty, and it is established by the faculty. It's like a faculty empowerment against top-down power. Like if we imagine a simple system of like faculty at the bottom and an angry governor or whatever at the top, it seems really well constructed and structured to deal with that. Almost like in criminal court, the state wields enormous power, and so we have to have due process and a jury of the defendant's peers, and that's like the academic senate and professional standards. Where I'm coming from is, and this has been touched on in the discussion, is if we add a third layer of power, even lower than faculty, students, and they've been recognized in this, then the analogy hasn't been carried all the way forward to a student-centered power, because individual faculty wield enormous power over them, analogously to the governor over y'all. Instead, faculty have said we're freedom of student scholarly inquiry is subordinate to academic freedom. So instead of democratizing down another layer, it's more like we're going to hang on to this too, and we're going to, be the sort of arbiters of that. And I don't take issue with that, but just since that's the structure, how do faculty, and especially faculty who serve on academic senates, how do you build and maintain your confidence that you're working in the students' interests rather than empowering them themselves? Does that question make sense?
It certainly makes sense, and I agree with your premise that the power does derive from the academic freedom of the faculty. So the freedom of student inquiry does derive from that, and therefore the faculty are in some sense the guarantors of that issue. But I would argue that the structure of a university, by its very nature, almost requires that kind of approach, because in the classroom, it isn't students who determine the material that's covered in the classroom. It's the faculty member who determines what's covered in the classroom, for example. It is assumed that there's a presumption within a university that faculty have a role to play in terms of determining the agenda. And while I certainly support as much freedom for students as possible, and in particular freedom for students to challenge faculty, as Brian indicated, I think that's actually healthy and good. Structurally, I'm not sure how you could make that work with any university.
So, Matt, if I may, the conception of academic freedom that we've been discussing is one that really arises from the notion of a profession. I mean, and that's kind of really well known. It's often called the guild notion.
Yeah.
And so, since it's sort of fundamentally rooted in professional standards, those who are the professionals have to sort of figure out what counts as quality. Okay, so ultimately, that's some notion of the faculty, as Bill pointed out, as an entity, or as it's found in the University of California, given our governance, the academic senate. The view that you were really looking at, I think, just rejects that point of view about academic freedom. And the reason it rejects that point of view about academic freedom is that it's based on power inequity. It's based on both internal to the profession, power internal to the profession itself, and the power that the profession yields, particularly over students, to exclude them, in a very sort of power paternalistic kind of way. So you get a rejection of the notion that academic freedom stems from professional standards, and you get to a number of different points of view. So, for example, one view is that academic freedom is really just First Amendment protections for all who live in an academic context. It doesn't have anything to do with professional standards. It's just a version of First Amendment rights. Another view is that academic freedom is just a kind of anarchic view. It's a very, it's just freedom in the anarchistic sense of freedom, right? That you basically have an environment where anybody can express any view and sort of anything goes. And any attempt to sort of rein that in, again, is inevitably tied to power structures within the institution, inherent racism, structural racism, and all sorts of other things that people find are embedded in our institutions. So there are a lot of different perspectives that come from the rejection of this kind of professionalism view that George and I have been discussing, and which we've discussed it because this is the one that governs and is embedded in UC policies, the way that we live as UC faculty members. But your point is a point of discussion. If you're going to really reject the role of professionalism as the driving it's really through the profession that academic freedom is bestowed, so to speak.
Thank you. Thank you for those answers. I should say that makes sense to me and it helps see how this framing isn't just sort of politically convenient for people who happen to be faculty. It's that buying into this definition actually, it makes the whole system work in a sense, if I'm following you correctly. Right. And no, I appreciate that a great deal.
I was simply going to draw our attention to the fact that we are running over our allotted time. Should you want to continue, I'm happy to stay, but many of you, and many have, already departed as they have other commitments in this time frame. So what is your pleasure? Do you want to hang on for another few minutes?
I'm happy to. I have no encumbrances at the moment, so.
Well, are there other questions? I think that's the key here. No? Well, okay. Then in that case, let me thank not just the speakers, but all of you participants for this very interesting, really interesting, lively discussion. And we'll look forward to continuing it at some future time.
Good pleasure.
So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Wonderful questions.
Great discussion.
Great. Okay. And keep in mind, it is recorded, and should you wish to refer to it, it will be available.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.